So Kate Nation is our next speaker, next panel presenter. So Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Jelena, and thank you, Jelena, for chairing us so splendidly, and Shonali for putting us all together over the entire globe, it feels like, today and yesterday and tomorrow. Really lovely to be here. What Shonali asked me to do was to summarise a theoretical position on language or literacy development, and in that context to discuss the good and bad of using Child Directed Print Corpora. So that's what I'm planning to do today. And so I guess the theoretical context that sort of sets up the work that I'm going to describe is really about reading experience, and the idea that reading experience and what children gain from reading experience is really important. And of course, this is not a new thing. We've known this for a long time. We can look at correlational evidence, first of all, across people, where there's a very strong correlation between how much an individual reads and how good they are at reading. And this is true in children, and it's true in adults, and it's probably some sort of reciprocal causation. Children who are better at reading read more. The more you read, the better you get at reading. And we also know, of course, at an item level that experience matters. The simple frequency effect tells us that, generally speaking, words that are more frequent are easier to read, easier to recognise than words that are less frequent. So there's strong correlational evidence between print exposure and reading ability, but really there's not been very much attention given to the question of what reading experience actually is. What does it comprise? What's its nature and content? And what does it do to drive children's development? And so from that sort of basis, the questions that we've gotten interested in and are working on at the moment, a range of big questions here about the nature and content of reading experience and how it changes and develops over time, and how this experience with written language, with print, shapes learning, and how learning itself then influences subsequent processing when words and structures are encountered. We've got really interested in picking up on what Mary Ellen's been talking about, the differences between written language and spoken language, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. But also, again, thinking as well of the implications of our work in terms of how we might want to change the nature and content of reading instruction to optimise it, to enhance learning and development. And we're doing this in two ways: by thinking about the language context of books, but also to think about other non-language factors that we know shape learning and memory, so things like spacing and retrieval practice. But for today, I'm just going to keep the focus on language content. When we look in the reading development literature and think about what people think about reading experience, of course, as I say, it's been known for a long time that reading experience is really important. And once the basic skills are in place, I guess many of us would think that that reading experience provides opportunity to practice and hone those basic skills and to develop that all-important reading fluency. So like going to the gym and flexing your biceps makes you stronger. So there's a sort of practice effect going on. But clearly there's much, much more than just simple practice and honing those basic skills. Reading experience provides opportunity to discover and begin to internalise the systematic regularities that are there in the writing system. And in a language like English, we can think about the systematic regularities between graphemes and phonemes, but also systematicity at other levels between orthography and morphology, for example. And we can also think about not just words in isolation, but as Mary Ellen was talking about in her presentation, these statistics are all correlated with each other and co-occurring with each other at multiple levels. And words are not experienced in isolation. We study them in isolation, those of us working on reading development, but of course in the child's experience, they occur in rich syntactic and contextual contexts. And particularly so when we think about the important differences between text, or as we call it, book language, versus the sorts of language opportunities children experience via spoken conversations. So we're interested in all of these different areas, and in particular the interconnections between them, and how experiencing words and structures in diverse and language-rich contexts changes and updates and promotes the internalizing of these systematic regularities that are there in the writing system, and how that in itself connects with basic skills and driving those forward in time. So we see all of these things being interconnected. In terms of sort of theoretical background, I thought I'd start with Perfetti's lexical quality hypothesis. This is what brought me to think about reading experience a little bit more broadly than I had done before. So for those of you who know this hypothesis, Perfetti talks about lexical quality as the extent to which the mental representation of a word specifies its form and meaning. So the identity of a word is comprised from its orthographic, its phonological, and its semantic constituents. And all these three things come together to form representations. High quality representations are more tightly bound, more stable, and he argues less context dependent. I don't agree with Perfetti on all of these points. I think particularly when it comes to thinking about semantics and meanings, I would argue that more stable and less context dependent isn't necessarily the goal of having a strong semantic representation. But the aspect of the lexical quality hypothesis I wanted to emphasize today is that we can think about lexical quality at two different levels, at the individual level of a child and variation between children. So some children have higher mean lexical quality than others. They're better readers than other children. And within all of us, we have some words that are represented with high lexical quality and other words that we find more difficult to process, that are more unusual words that have low lexical quality for us. So we've got this nice duality between items and children here. Perfetti sees lexical quality as being absolutely vital to reading comprehension. And the argument in the lexical quality hypothesis is that an item or a child's lexical quality sets up efficient and context-independent word reading, word identification, and that in turn is critical for driving reading comprehension and providing the substrate of reading comprehension, of reading experience, sorry. And this makes absolute sense. But where I think the field has been lacking detail is what exactly drives variation in lexical quality. Why are some children more lexically high quality than others? And particularly for words, what drives these differences between words? And the way we've been thinking about this, and this has been really informed by the corpus work that we've been doing, is by connecting learning and processing. So we see an episode with a word or with a syntactic structure, this process encounter as an opportunity to learn. That learning in terms shapes the statistics of the system at that point in time, what the child knows at that point in time, the child's knowledge, such that when the word is encountered on a subsequent occasion, processing is somewhat different because learning has happened. And we can think of things cycling around this processing learning opportunity loop, and that's what drives development over longitudinal time or developmental time. So connecting this back to the lexical quality hypothesis, we're testing ideas about how lexical quality is driven by encounters and learning opportunities provided by this feedback loop and how this drives and develops over time. And of course, the substrate for this must be in reading comprehension and in reading experience. So although lexical quality is the driver of reading comprehension, I would see lexical quality itself as being the product of comprehension and experience, not just the driver of it. So really important to test this idea then is to begin to unpack what we mean by experience. And this is where the corpus analyses and corpus work has been really instrumental. So we've heard a little bit from Yelling's talk today and Nikki's yesterday about some of the corpora that we're working with. So we're fortunate to have access to large developmental corpora of material written for children to read or for children to hear, but also children's own writing. And that allows us to capture experience and extract lexical statistics. And the size of the corpora are large enough that we can do this by age, we can do it by genre, by fiction and non-fiction, and also by book type. So a picture book, for example, targeted at younger children, or chapter books targeted at slightly older children. And then we can take these corpus statistics and relate them to performance on a variety of different language tasks in children and adults. And then building from this, we can use these data to try and begin to think about causality by designing experiments that manipulate the linguistic or other features of the input and examine the effects on learning and performance. So I'm just going to highlight this approach and the utility of this approach so far in three different ways. First of all, thinking about internalizing regularities. Secondly, by thinking a little bit more about the nature and content of book language. And then finally, by talking a little bit about contextual history. So internalizing regularities, I'm not going to say much here because we heard about this, those of us who were here yesterday from Nikki Dawson's talk. And the idea here, and again, picking up on comments made in Mary Allen's talk just now, writing systems are structured and quasi-regular. And we can think very usefully, I think, about learning to read as being a process in which children's own reading systems need to become reflective of the statistical structure of the writing system. This needs to be embodied by the children. And yesterday, in Nikki's talk, we heard a little bit about how we can use corpus analyses to track the development of systematic links between orthography and morphology, and how these vary via age, by taking developmental slices through the corpus, and also by genre. And then in following on from that, showing how people are sensitive to these types of regularities. So a way of connecting experience with performance there. In terms of book language, this has been a big focus of work over the last couple of years. First of all, just to say a few comments about lexical richness. So this paper was just recently published in a new journal. If you don't know this journal yet, be sure to check it out, Language Development Research. It's an online journal completely open access, and all following principles of reproducible science. So in this paper, led by Nikki Dawson, we created our own picture book corpus. This is quite a small one. It's only about 300,000 words or so. So these are picture books primarily aimed at preschool children. And we compared the language content, the lexical richness of the language content, with data taken from Child Directed Speech from the UK component of the Child S sample. And this allowed us to look at the nature and content of book language versus spoken language for children of approximately the same age. What Nikki found in those analyses was that book language contains more unique words, more complex words, and more meaning-bearing words than child-directed speech, very much replicating earlier work by Jessica Montag and colleagues. And we also found that words most characteristic of children's books are later acquired, they're more abstract, and connecting perhaps with some of the themes of Steve's talk, more emotionally arousing than words that are most characteristic of child-directed speech. So implications of this then, well, it clearly demonstrates that book language, even books aimed at preschoolers, provides unique language input. It's not the same language that children are getting for free in their homes. So children begin to build literary language well before they can read themselves. And there are clear implications here, I think, for children starting school with less exposure to book language. And in turn, I think implications for what we're assessing when we assess children's vocabulary. Are we really assessing spoken language vocabulary, as many of us think, or are items on the Peabody or something like that really a reflection of the type of language exposure that children have had via printed material? Another way that we've been looking at book language and comparing it with spoken language, Yaling touched on in her talk, is by looking at syntactic complexity. And this is an example of how we've been able to, again, compare different types of corpora across development and across modality. So what Yaling did here, as she talked about in her talk, she used the same picture book corpus that was developed for the lexical richness study and compared that with spoken language, again, to allow a direct comparison between picture book language and spoken language. And she also compared the picture book corpus to the rather huge corpus that we've been working with, the Oxford Children's Corpus, sampled at this paper at about 34 million words. And this allowed her to trace the development of complex syntax from picture books aimed at preschool children through to material written for much older children. And again, the size of this corpus allowed investigations by age and by genre. And as you heard from Yaling's talk, big differences across these different registers. So book language contains more complex sentences than child-directed speech. Relative clauses are very rare in spoken input. Syntactic complexity increases with the intended age, and it also is modulated by genre. But even picture books, even those books written for preschool children to listen to, are more complex than child-directed speech in particular ways. And the types of relative clause co-occurred in text with specific lexical properties. So features such as noun animacy and pronoun use were systematically associated with the types of clauses that were used, aligning with the discourse functions and the patterns that we subsequently see in sentence processing experiments. Again, showing very close connections between the nature of the input and how that is used by kids as they read and listen to language. So thinking of the implications of that, again, evidence that book language provides unique language input from an early age. Exposure to written language, whether that's by children reading themselves or via shared reading, provides experience with syntactic structures that are not easily encountered in everyday speech. So again, we can think about the implications of this work for children who are starting school with less exposure to book language. And again, I think important questions to think about in terms of assessment. Those of you that know Dorothy Bishop's test for the reception of grammar will know that some of the later blocks of that assessment use items that are sort of heavy relative clauses and so on. You think, well, how much is this tapping language as opposed to reading exposure? And so what are we really measuring on that assessment of that type of structure? Is it children's spoken language skills, or is it their reading ability that of course derives from spoken language abilities and the same mechanisms presumably originally, but is a reflection of the sorts of reading experiences that the kids have had and what they've learned from those reading experiences. So the idea of language shaping reading, and then reading itself and reading experience shaping the latter stages of language development. So the final way that we've been using, well, not the final way I'm going to talk about today that we've been using our various corpora is to think about capturing lexical history. So the idea here is that by taking a sort of developmental look at these large corpora, we can really get an index of experience of how language and language input might change over time. And as well as thinking about how that experience might influence children's learning, we can also trace the development of words through that sort of experience. So a word that I might read a certain level of frequency of for me, that word has obviously been encountered in lots of different episodes and lots of different contexts throughout my lifetime. I have my own unique database of words that have been shaped by my own language experiences. And we've been wanting to try and use the corpora to capture that sort of lexical history of item knowledge, and then again, relate that to processing in experimental tasks. So one question we've asked here about contextual history is, does variation in contextual experience with a word shape how easily it's processed beyond the amount of experience? So a simple way of thinking about this is by contrasting it with just frequency. So we know frequency is important. Frequency effects are, as I said earlier, fairly ubiquitous. But does the nature of frequency matter as opposed to just the number of frequency, the number of encounters? So to take an example here, imagine a word that has a frequency of 100. Does it matter if me as an individual, if I've seen that word 100 times in one single text on one single day, versus seeing it 100 different times, but only once. So seeing it 100 different times, but only once in 100 different texts, possibly on different days, for example. The frequency is the same, but the nature of the experience that I've had with that word could differ quite dramatically. Well, it will differ quite dramatically, but the question is, what does this do for the lexical quality of that item in my lexicon? So one way that we've been trying to capture this is by playing around with a variable that's called semantic diversity. Very briefly and very simplistically, this is a statistic that captures the similarity in meaning across all the different contexts a word has appeared in across a large language sample. So we calculate it, it's derived from the corpus itself. So if I just give an example here just to illustrate the point, if you think of a word like broccoli, that would be an example of a low diversity word, because nearly every time you encounter the word broccoli, it's in a context which is something about food. I mean, obviously they'll vary a lot, but generally it would be something food related. If we compare that with a word like chance, would be a good word, a highly diverse word. So chance, encountering the word chance doesn't tell you anything about the nature of or doesn't tell you as much about the nature of the context in which that word occurs. So we can use the corpus to derive this semantic diversity metric and begin to separate the contextual experience of a word from the actual just raw repetition frequency of a word, and then use those lexical statistics to select items that then go into a variety of different experiments. And in a number of different experiments, we've shown that this measure of semantic diversity is doing something different to frequency. And so the implication here is how you've experienced a word at a large level, and by a large level, I mean in a rich semantic context, to do with meaning, to do with experience, to do with inferencing, to do with big aspects of language, really shapes and influences your performance on isolated lexical decision tasks or word recognition tasks. So something about big experience changes things at an individual item level. And that's quite an interesting set of findings, I think.
Kate, you've got a couple of minutes left.
Thank you, Jelena. Thank you. Yeah. So relating that sort of comment there back to the lexical quality hypothesis, I think thinking about contextual experience in this way is a way of thinking about how reading comprehension or language comprehension and the substrate, the data that the comprehension operates across, we can really begin to think about how those encounters and episodes build over time to shape and drive the development of lexical quality. Now, of course, one negative thing or limitation of corpus analyses is that the work I've been describing so far are all completely correlational studies. And to really understand contextual history and variables like semantic diversity, we need to do experiments that manipulate and control the input in careful ways. And so combining the corpus analyses with experiments that measure word learning, for example, where we control the statistics, is hopefully going to make some progress there. So just to sum up then, what does the reading experience do? This is a huge question, and I think it clearly does a lot. The work I've just touched on today is sort of trying to set up this idea of a processing encounter leading to a learning opportunity that changes processing, and we can think about that going round and round over developmental time as a way of sort of accumulating the statistics, and it's those statistics that are really influencing both item level variation and individual level variation. And of course, experience is doing more than that. And I think we need to consider print exposure as much more than just a correlate or a consequence of reading ability, although it clearly is a correlate and a consequence of reading ability. Print exposure or reading experience provides opportunity to experience language that's quite different to spoken language. And that, it seems, would shape both reading development, but also language development. So I mentioned earlier that in the reading development field, we're used to thinking about spoken language setting the foundation for reading. And many of us, I've certainly written this myself in the past, that reading comprehension is essentially language comprehension written down once you take the word identification out of the equation. I don't think that is the case anymore, and that I've become more convinced that that's not the case the more I look at our corpus work. That language is leading to reading, but then reading itself is leading to changes in language. But also broader consequences too. So I was interested in other talks in the session this afternoon about emotion. We've seen emotion differences just springing out of our corpus analyses without even trying to look at them. They just come out when we look at the words, that we can see clear differences across registers. That's also there in children's own writing. So it'd be good to talk with Steve about that. We can think about the language of mental health, which the terms there, they're abstract, they're slippery, they're much more frequent in written language than they are in spoken language, as are the syntactic structures that we use to talk about theory of mind and our own mental states and psychological worlds. Social stereotypes, gender, we've been seeing clear gender differences in the children's corpora as well. Depressingly, even in language written for children, male protagonists are completely overrepresented, and that's true in boys' writing as well, relative to girls' writing. And we can also think about legal speak. I've just been going through the process of buying a house, and I've been really struck by the book language that my solicitor speaks to me in, and it really is quite complex syntax and unusual vocabulary that isn't representative of conversational language more generally. And again, the implications that I've already mentioned along the way. In terms of good and bad, this is my final slide, Jelena, and I think I've made most of these points along the way, but I think the corpus work that I've been doing over the past few years has provided unique insights that have made me think and reconsider key questions in a different way. there's big advantages to this sort of data. It's huge and it's relatively representative. But of course, the downside of that is that it's not representative of any individual at all. It's massive sort of experience that is not characteristic of the experience any individual has. I've already mentioned the correlational point. I think the comparison between written versus spoken is perhaps a little bit too blunt. We need to think about narrative versus non-narrative language. Think about the oracy tradition, which is perhaps more similar to written language than spoken language, is in conversational language. And then also just to finish on some more procedural points about the challenges of corpus analyses and the difficulties of sharing written language corpora with respect to copyright and things like that, which might be of interest to people to talk about. But I'll end now, thank you, with thanking my collaborators, particularly Nikki and Yalenga who are here today, and Nilanjana from Oxford University Press and other collaborators who've supported this work along the way. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Yelena.